Black girl's letter to God sparks miraculous healing. The hospital room was deathly quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Dr. Margaret Wilson stood frozen, staring at the medical chart that should have shown terminal cancer but now displayed inexplicable results. Her hands trembled. "This is impossible," she whispered, looking at the elderly man who just days ago had been given weeks to live. Thomas Jenkins now sat upright in his hospital bed, color returned to his face, smiling as if nothing had happened. "It was the letter," Thomas said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "That little girl's letter to God saved my life." Nurse Roberts rushed in, clutching another set of test results. "Dr. Wilson, it's happening again. Mrs. Patterson in room 312, her kidney function has completely normalized." And Mr. Davis in 318, his heart. Dr. Wilson's clipboard clattered to the floor as chaos erupted in the hospital wing. Staff rushed between rooms, confirming what couldn't be explained by medical science. Patients once considered terminal were rapidly improving. "Where is she?" Dr. Wilson demanded. "Where's the little girl who wrote that letter?" "She's gone," Thomas replied, tears welling in his eyes. "Her grandmother took her home this morning." But her letter, it's still making its way through the hospital, room to room, heart to heart. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 days earlier when 10-year-old Sadie Johnson first walked through the hospital doors with her grandmother. 3 days earlier, Sadie Johnson clutched her grandmother's hand as they entered Riverside Community Hospital. The antiseptic smell made her wrinkle her nose. Sadie had never liked hospitals. They reminded her of when her mother got sick 3 years ago and never came home. "Remember what we talked about, Sadie," her grandmother Esther said gently, her voice carrying the warmth and wisdom of her 68 years. "Your Uncle Thomas is very sick, but seeing you will brighten his day." Sadie nodded solemnly. She wore her Sunday best, a yellow dress with small white flowers, because Grandma Esther said that looking your best showed respect. Her natural hair was styled in 2 neat puffs secured with yellow ribbons that matched her dress. The year was 1972, and Riverside was one of the few hospitals in their part of Atlanta where black patients could receive treatment without being relegated to basement wards. Even so, Esther Johnson straightened her back as they approached the reception desk, her dignity a shield against any potential slight. "We're here to see Thomas Jenkins," Esther stated clearly. The receptionist, a middle-aged white woman with cat-eye glasses and hair set in a rigid helmet of curls, checked her clipboard. "Room 215, second floor." She barely looked up. As they rode the elevator, Sadie clutched the paper bag containing the items she'd brought for her uncle, a hand-drawn card, a small Bible from her Sunday school graduation, and a letter she'd written last night after Grandma told her Uncle Thomas might not get better. "Grandma, will my letter really help Uncle Thomas?" Sadie asked, her voice small in the confines of the elevator. "Baby faith can move mountains," Esther replied. "Your words come from your heart, and God hears every word we speak in faith." The elevator doors opened to reveal a busy hospital corridor. Nurses in crisp white uniforms moved efficiently between rooms. A doctor with a stethoscope draped around his neck hurried past, not sparing them a glance. Room 215 was at the end of the hall. Esther knocked gently before pushing the door open. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a gloomy half-light. The television mounted in the corner was off, and the only sound was the labored breathing coming from the bed. "Thomas," Esther called softly, "we're here." Sadie stayed close to the door as her grandmother approached the bed. The man lying there barely resembled the Uncle Thomas who had once swung her high in the air at family barbecues and taught her how to bait a fishing hook at the lake. His face was gaunt, his once robust frame now seemingly swallowed by the hospital bed. "Look who I brought to see you," Esther said, gesturing for Sadie to come closer. Thomas's eyes, sunken but still bright with intelligence, focused on Sadie. A weak smile transformed his face. "There's my Sadie girl," he rasped. Sadie moved forward, fighting the urge to cry. "Hi, Uncle Thomas, I brought you some things." She placed the paper bag on his bedside table. "Well now, what treasures did you bring me?" Thomas asked, his voice stronger as he focused on his niece. Sadie carefully removed each item. "I made you a card with your favorite flowers, daisies, and here's a Bible like mine from Sunday school." She hesitated before pulling out the folded piece of lined paper. "And I wrote a letter." "A letter." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Who's it addressed to?" Sadie glanced at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. "It's addressed to God," Sadie admitted. "It's about you." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "Would you read it to me, Sadie girl?" Sadie unfolded the paper, the creases well worn from the many times she had reread her own words. She took a deep breath and began. Dear God, my name is Sadie Johnson. I am 10 years old. My Uncle Thomas is very sick. The doctors say he has cancer. Grandma says you can do anything, even things doctors can't do. I'm writing to ask if you could please make Uncle Thomas better. He is a good man. He helps everybody. When the storm came last year and Mr. Patterson's roof broke, Uncle Thomas fixed it for free. When Miss Loretta's car wouldn't start, Uncle Thomas fixed that too. He teaches the boys at church how to play baseball on Saturdays. Nobody makes fried catfish as good as him. Please don't take him to heaven yet. We need him here. If you make him better, I promise to be good and help Grandma more. Thank you for listening. Your friend, Sadie Johnson. Silence filled the room when she finished. Thomas had tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. Esther dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. That's the most beautiful letter I've ever heard, Thomas said finally. May I keep it here with me? Sadie nodded and placed the letter on his bedside table, propped against the water pitcher. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Dr. Margaret Wilson entered, clipboard in hand. She was one of the few female doctors at Riverside, her journey to medicine having begun in the late 1950s when women were still fighting for equal footing in the profession. Good afternoon, she said, her tone professional but kind. I need to check Mr. Jenkins's vitals. Of course, doctor, Esther said, taking Sadie's hand. We'll step out for a moment. Actually, Dr. Wilson said, glancing at Sadie, I was hoping to speak with both of you afterward if you don't mind waiting in the visitor's lounge. The worried look that passed between Esther and Thomas wasn't lost on Sadie. Something was wrong, something the adults weren't saying. In the visitor's lounge, which smelled of stale coffee and old magazines, Sadie thumbed through a dog-eared issue of Life magazine while her grandmother sat rigidly in an orange plastic chair. Grandma, Uncle Thomas is going to get better, isn't he? Sadie asked. Before Esther could answer, Dr. Wilson appeared in the doorway. Her face was composed, but there was a gentleness in her eyes that spoke volumes. Mrs. Johnson, could we speak privately? The doctor asked. Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of my granddaughter, Esther replied firmly. We don't keep secrets in our family. Dr. Wilson hesitated, then nodded. She sat across from them, placing her clipboard on her lap. Mrs. Johnson, the cancer has spread further than we initially thought. The treatments aren't working as we hoped. I think it's time to discuss comfort care. Comfort care? Esther repeated, her voice hollow. Making sure Mr. Jenkins is as comfortable as possible for the time he has left, Dr. Wilson explained gently. How much time? Esther asked, her hand tightening around Sadie's. It's difficult to say exactly. Perhaps a few weeks. Sadie felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. She remembered when they'd said similar things about her mother. Weeks had turned into days, and then she was gone. No, Sadie whispered, then louder. No, he can't die. I wrote to God. I asked him to make Uncle Thomas better. Dr. Wilson's expression softened as she looked at Sadie. That was a very kind thing to do, and I know your uncle appreciates it very much. But it has to work, Sadie insisted, tears welling in her eyes. Grandma says God answers prayers. He does, child, Esther said, pulling Sadie close, but sometimes the answer isn't what we want to hear. Dr. Wilson stood, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. I'll give you some time. Mr. Jenkins is resting now, but you can see him again in an hour or so. After the doctor left, Sadie turned to her grandmother. I need to write another letter, she said with determination. To God. No, to everybody in the hospital. If one letter isn't enough, maybe lots of letters will be. Esther studied her granddaughter's face, seeing the same determination that had characterized her own daughter Sadie's mother before cancer took her too young. What do you mean, child? If everybody in the hospital writes to God about Uncle Thomas, maybe he'll listen better, Sadie explained, as if it were the most logical conclusion. Rather than discourage her granddaughter's innocent plan, Esther reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad and pencil. Then you'd better get started. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. For the next hour, Sadie wrote. Her second letter was simpler than the first, more of a template for others to follow. Dear God, please help Thomas Jenkins in room 215 get better. He is a good man who helps others. Thank you. From your name, she copied this message over and over, filling page after page until her hand cramped and the pencil grew dull. When they returned to Thomas's room, he was awake but tired. A nurse was checking his IV, making notes on his chart. Mr. Jenkins has a busy evening ahead with tests, the nurse said. You might want to say your goodbyes for today and come back tomorrow. As they prepared to leave, Sadie approached the nurse. Excuse me, ma'am, could you give these to the other patients? She held out her stack of letters. The nurse, whose name tag read Roberts, looked confused. What are these, honey? Letters to God about my uncle, Sadie explained earnestly. If everybody asks God to help him, I think he'll listen better. Nurse Roberts glanced at Esther, who shrugged slightly as if to say, "What harm could it do?" "Well," Nurse Roberts said, taking the papers, "I can't promise everyone will write one, but I'll see that they get these." "Thank you," Sadie said with the solemn gratitude of a child who believes adults will always do what they say. As they left the hospital, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Esther's old Buick Skylark, a '65 model she'd bought second-hand when it was nearly new, sat waiting like a faithful friend. "Grandma, do you think it will work?" Sadie asked as they drove home past storefronts with "Soul Brother" signs in the windows, markers of black-owned businesses that had survived the unrest following Dr. King's assassination just 4 years earlier. "I think you've done something beautiful," Esther answered truthfully. "Faith like yours is precious. Don't ever lose it, no matter what happens." That evening, in the small house on Magnolia Street where 3 generations of Johnsons had lived, Sadie helped her grandmother prepare dinner. The radio played softly in the background, the staple singers, "I'll Take You There," providing a soundtrack to their quiet domestic routine. As night fell, Sadie knelt beside her bed for prayers as she'd done every night of her young life. But tonight, her prayers held a desperate intensity that kept her on her knees long after her usual bedtime. Meanwhile, across town at Riverside Community Hospital, something unexpected was happening. Nurse Roberts had distributed Sadie's letters throughout the hospital during her rounds. Some patients had smiled indulgently at the child's handwriting. Others had set the papers aside without much thought. But some, those facing their own mortality or struggling with painful recoveries, had been touched by the simple request. In room 312, Eleanor Patterson, a 72-year-old with failing kidneys, held the letter with trembling hands. She hadn't prayed since her husband died in '68, but something about the childish scrawl moved her. That night she whispered her own prayer for Thomas Jenkins, a man she'd never met. In room 318, Richard Davis, recovering from his second heart attack, read the letter and remembered his own children at that age, before they grew up and moved away, before the divorce that left him alone. He added his voice to the prayer for the stranger in room 215. By midnight, Nurse Roberts was startled to find Mr. Davis sitting up in bed, asking for water, something he hadn't done for himself in days. And Mrs. Patterson's most recent lab work showed slight improvement in her kidney function, not dramatic, but unexpected. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Sadie woke early, eager to return to the hospital. She wore a blue dress today, her hair in the same style but with blue ribbons. "Can we go now, Grandma?" she asked as soon as breakfast was cleared away. "The hospital has visiting hours, child," Esther reminded her. "We can't go until 10 o'clock. Those 2 hours felt like an eternity to Sadie. She paced the porch, watched the Johnsons' cat stalk birds in the yard, and reorganized her small collection of Nancy Drew mysteries 3 different ways. When they finally arrived at the hospital, there was a different atmosphere, subtle but noticeable. The same receptionist with the cat-eye glasses looked up when they entered, this time with recognition in her eyes. "You're the family of Thomas Jenkins," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Esther replied. "Is something wrong?" No, the receptionist said. "Just Dr. Wilson asked to be notified when you arrived. Please have a seat. She'll be right with you." Sadie and her grandmother exchanged worried glances as they sat in the waiting area. Had Uncle Thomas taken a turn for the worse? Had he passed during the night? Dr. Wilson appeared minutes later, her white coat slightly rumpled as if she'd been wearing it for too long. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "Mrs. Johnson, Sadie," she greeted them. "Before you see Mr. Jenkins, I wanted to speak with you." "Is he—" Esther couldn't finish the sentence. "He's stable," Dr. Wilson said quickly, "but something unusual has happened overnight. His latest blood work shows a significant reduction in cancer markers, and he's not the only one. We have several patients showing unexpected improvements." Sadie looked up at the doctor. "Did people write the letters?" Dr. Wilson blinked, momentarily confused. "Letters, the ones I gave to Nurse Roberts," Sadie explained. "The letters to God about Uncle Thomas." Understanding dawned on Dr. Wilson's face. "Those letters, yes, apparently they were distributed. But Mrs. Johnson, I want to be clear. While we're seeing some improvements, I don't want to raise false hopes. These could be temporary fluctuations." "May we see him now?" Esther asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions she must have been feeling. "Of course. He's awake and asking for you." As they walked toward room 215, Sadie noticed patients watching them from doorways and beds. Their gazes followed the little girl in the blue dress with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something like hope. Thomas was sitting up when they entered his room. There was more color in his face than the day before, and he was eating from a breakfast tray, actually eating, not just moving food around his plate. "There's my family," he said, his voice noticeably stronger. Esther rushed to his side, taking his hand. "Thomas, how are you feeling?" "Better than yesterday," he replied. "Don't know what they put in that IV, but I slept like a baby and woke up hungry for the first time in weeks." Sadie approached the bed cautiously, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "Uncle Thomas, come here, Sadie girl," he said, patting the edge of the bed. She climbed up carefully, mindful of his IV line. "Did you keep my letter?" "Right here," Thomas said, reaching for the folded paper on his bedside table. "Been keeping it close. But something tells me I'm not the only one with one of your letters." Sadie ducked her head. "I wrote more, for the other patients to send to God, too." Thomas chuckled, then winced slightly as the movement pulled at something sore. "You've been busy." Throughout the day, a steady stream of hospital staff found reasons to pass by room 215. Lab technicians, orderlies, even the cafeteria staff on their breaks, all walked by, glancing in with curious expressions. Word had spread about the letters and the mysterious improvements in multiple patients. By afternoon, Dr. Wilson returned with more test results. She spoke quietly with Thomas and Esther while Sadie was distracted by a book nurse Roberts had brought her. "The cancer hasn't disappeared," Dr. Wilson explained in hushed tones, "but it's showing signs of regression that I can't explain medically. We've seen spontaneous remissions before, but not like this, and certainly not multiple cases in different patients with different conditions simultaneously." "You think it has something to do with the letters," Esther stated. It wasn't a question. Dr. Wilson sighed. "I'm a woman of science, Mrs. Johnson. I believe in what I can see under a microscope or measure with instruments, but I've been a doctor long enough to know there are things science can't yet explain." She glanced at Sadie. "And sometimes the most powerful medicine is hope." That evening, as Sadie and her grandmother prepared to leave, Nurse Roberts approached them in the hallway. "Mrs. Johnson, Sadie, I thought you should know something. Those letters Sadie wrote, they didn't stay just on this floor. Someone made copies, and they've spread throughout the hospital. We've got patients in every department asking about Thomas Jenkins and the little girl who wrote to God for him." Esther's hand tightened around Sadie's. "Is that causing problems?" Nurse Roberts shook her head. "Quite the opposite. I've been nursing for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Patients who were refusing treatment are now cooperating. People who haven't spoken in days are talking. It's as if..." She stopped, searching for words. "As if what?" Sadie prompted. "As if everyone suddenly remembered they're not alone," Nurse Roberts finished. "That there's something bigger than their own problems." As they walked to the parking lot, Sadie looked up at the hospital windows, imagining all the people inside, strangers united by her simple letters. "Grandma, do you think God is listening now?" Esther looked down at her granddaughter, this child who had already endured the loss of her mother and now faced the potential loss of her beloved uncle. "Baby, I think God was always listening. Sometimes we just need to be reminded to listen too." The next morning, they arrived at the hospital to find a television news van in the parking lot. A reporter was speaking with the hospital's administrator near the entrance. "What's happening?" Sadie asked as they hurried past. "I don't know, child, but let's get inside," Esther replied, guiding Sadie through the doors. The receptionist with the cat-eye glasses actually smiled when she saw them. "Dr. Wilson asked that you go directly up. She's waiting for you." They found Dr. Wilson outside Thomas's room, deep in conversation with two other doctors Sadie didn't recognize. All three looked up when Sadie and Esther approached. "Mrs. Johnson, Sadie," Dr. Wilson greeted them. "These are my colleagues, Dr. Friedman and Dr. Lewis. They've been consulting on your brother's case." Esther shook hands with the doctors, her expression guarded. "Is something wrong?" "Quite the contrary," Dr. Friedman said. He was older than Dr. Wilson, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "We're seeing continued improvement in Mr. Jenkins's condition, and not just him, we now have documented cases of unexpected recoveries throughout the hospital." "The press got wind of it," Dr. Lewis added. She was a young black woman, one of the few in the hospital's medical staff. "They're calling it the Riverside Miracle." Sadie tugged at Dr. Wilson's coat. "Can we see Uncle Thomas now?" The doctors exchanged glances. "Of course," Dr. Wilson said. "He's been asking for you." Thomas was not only sitting up today, but was in a chair beside the window, watching the activity in the parking lot below. He turned when they entered, his face lighting up. "There's my girls," he said, opening his arms. Sadie ran to him, carefully embracing him as Esther hung back, hardly believing the transformation from 2 days ago. "Uncle Thomas, there's a TV truck outside," Sadie reported. "I know," Thomas chuckled. "Seems we've caused quite a stir." "We," Esther questioned, finally approaching. Sadie's letters, Thomas explained. They're all anyone's talking about. Did you know they've spread to other floors, even other hospitals now, from what the nurses tell me? Before Esther could respond, there was a knock at the door. Nurse Roberts entered, looking apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some patients who'd like to meet Sadie. If that's all right with you, Mrs. Johnson. Esther hesitated. What patients? Mrs. Patterson from 312 and Mr. Davis from 318 for starters. They're in the solarium, They're among those showing unexpected improvements. Thomas nodded encouragingly. Go on, Sadie girl, your grandma and I will be right here. Nurse Roberts led Sadie to the solarium at the end of the hall, a bright space with plants and comfortable chairs where ambulatory patients could spend time outside their rooms. Several people were gathered there, including an elderly woman in a wheelchair and a middle-aged man with a hospital gown over his clothes. This is Sadie, Nurse Roberts announced. The patients looked at Sadie with expressions ranging from curiosity to something close to reverence. It made Sadie uncomfortable until the elderly woman in the wheelchair spoke. You're the one who wrote the letters, she said. I'm Alina Patterson, Sadie nodded. Yes, ma'am. Do you know what's happened because of those letters, child? Mrs. Patterson asked. When Sadie shook her head, Mr. Davis spoke up. They've brought us together, made us remember we're not just patients, we're people, with families and stories and faith. I've been in and out of hospitals for 3 years, said another woman, younger than the others. Never knew the names of the people in the rooms next to mine until yesterday. Now we're praying together, sharing meals, it's like we remembered how to be human. As the patients shared their stories, Sadie began to understand that something bigger than Uncle Thomas's recovery was happening. The letters had created connections between people who would otherwise have remained strangers, suffering in isolation. When she returned to room 215, Sadie found Dr. Wilson there again, showing Thomas and Esther new test results. It's not a complete remission, Dr. Wilson was explaining, but the reduction in tumor size is significant enough that we're revisiting treatment options. Surgery might be possible now, followed by a more targeted chemotherapy approach. What does that mean? Sadie asked from the doorway. The adults turned, and Dr. Wilson smiled. It means your uncle has a fighting chance, Sadie, a much better chance than he had 3 days ago. The next day was Sunday. Thomas insisted that Esther and Sadie go to church rather than spending the entire day at the hospital. The doctors say I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, he joked. You go give thanks where it's due. Mount Zion Baptist Church had stood on the same corner for over 80 years. The red brick building with its modest steeple had been a cornerstone of the black community through segregation, the civil rights movement, and beyond. Inside, the polished wooden pews gleamed in the light streaming through stained glass windows. Esther and Sadie slipped into their usual spot 3 rows from the front. As they settled in, Sadie noticed people watching them, whispering behind church fans and hymn books. Reverend Williams, who had led the congregation for 25 years, ascended to the pulpit as the choir finished the opening hymn. His deep voice filled the sanctuary. Brothers and sisters, I had a sermon prepared for today. Had it all written out about perseverance through trials. But then I heard about what's happening over at Riverside Hospital. A murmur rippled through the congregation. I heard about a little girl who wrote a letter to God, Reverend Williams continued, his gaze finding Sadie in the pew. A letter asking for healing for her uncle, a letter that has now touched hundreds of lives. Sadie shrank against her grandmother as heads turned toward them. Now I don't know if what they're calling the Riverside miracle is divine intervention or the power of community or just plain coincidence. But I do know this faith like a child's can move mountains. Jesus himself told us so. The service that followed was unlike any Sadie had experienced. People stood to share stories of hope and healing, of reconciliations and second chances. Mrs. Gladys Taylor, the church secretary who had lost her son in Vietnam, spoke of finally feeling peace after years of anger. Mr. Henry Coleman, who hadn't spoken to his brother in a decade over a business dispute, announced he'd called him that morning. After church, the congregation surrounded Sadie and Esther, offering prayers for Thomas and sharing their own stories of faith rewarded. It was overwhelming, but Sadie noticed her grandmother standing taller, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. When they arrived at the hospital that afternoon, they found Thomas's room filled with flowers, cards, and small gifts from well-wishers, many from people he'd never met. It's getting out of hand, Thomas said, but he was smiling. Had a rabbi visit this morning, and a Catholic priest, and 3 different ministers from churches I've never set foot in. The newspaper called it a wave of healing and reconciliation. Nurse Roberts reported when she came to check Thomas's vitals. They're saying it started here, but it's spreading. People reconnecting with estranged family members, reaching out to neighbors they've been feuding with. For 3 more days, the phenomenon continued. Thomas's condition improved steadily. Other patients reported similar progress. The hospital became a place of pilgrimage, with visitors bringing more letters to add to Sadie's original message. On the 4th day, Dr. Wilson scheduled Thomas for the surgery that would remove the now-reduced tumor. Sadie and Esther waited in the surgical waiting room, surrounded by other families whose loved ones were also undergoing procedures. Hours passed. Sadie dozed against her grandmother's shoulder. Esther prayed quietly, her worn Bible open in her lap. Finally, Dr. Wilson appeared in the doorway, still wearing her surgical cap. Her expression was unreadable as she approached them. "Mrs. Johnson, Sadie," she said, sitting across from them. "The surgery is complete." "How is he?" Esther asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Wilson's professional composure cracked slightly, a smile breaking through. "We were able to remove the entire tumor. And something else, when we got in there, we found the cancer hadn't spread nearly as far as the initial scans indicated. It's as if it had retreated." "So he's going to be okay?" Sadie asked, fully awake now. "He has a long recovery ahead and he'll need follow-up treatments," Dr. Wilson cautioned. "But yes, I believe he has an excellent chance of making a full recovery." Esther closed her eyes, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for everything you've done." "I'm not sure how much of this was my doing," Dr. Wilson admitted, "but I'm grateful to have been part of it." As they sat with Thomas in the recovery room later that day, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Nurse Roberts appeared in the doorway, looking flustered. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a situation developing. The press is downstairs in force, not just local stations, but national news. They're calling it the Miracle on Magnolia Street now, after your address, Sadie. They want interviews, statements." Thomas, groggy but alert, reached for Sadie's hand. "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to, Sadie girl. The hospital administration is trying to manage the situation," Nurse Roberts continued. "But I thought you should know this story has taken on a life of its own." And so it had. Over the next few days, as Thomas continued to recover, the story of Sadie's letters spread far beyond Atlanta. Newspapers across the country carried headlines about the miracle child and the wave of healing. Television crews camped outside the hospital, hoping for glimpses of the little girl whose faith had sparked a movement. Esther steadfastly refused all interview requests. "My granddaughter is not a spectacle," she told the hospital administrator firmly. "She's a child who loves her uncle, that's all." But the story couldn't be contained. Letters began arriving at the hospital addressed simply to Sadie, the miracle child, Riverside Hospital, Atlanta. People sent their own prayers, their own stories of hope and healing and reconciliation. A week after Thomas's surgery, as they prepared for his discharge, Dr. Wilson came to say goodbye. "I want you to know something," she said, addressing Sadie directly. "In medical school, they taught us that healing happens in the body. But what I've witnessed here has shown me that true healing involves the spirit as well. You reminded an entire hospital, an entire community of that truth." Sadie, overwhelmed by the attention and the gravity of the doctor's words, simply nodded. As they helped Thomas into Esther's Buick, a small crowd of well-wishers gathered in the parking lot. Patients in wheelchairs and hospital gowns, staff members on their breaks, visitors all wanting to catch a glimpse of the family at the center of the Riverside miracle. "This is going to follow us for a while," Thomas said as they drove away. "Are you ready for that, Sadie girl?" Sadie looked back at the hospital, thinking of all the people inside who had read her letters, who had prayed for a man they didn't know, who had found connection in a place usually marked by isolation. "I just wanted you to get better, Uncle Thomas," she said simply. "And I am," he assured her. "But something tells me this story is bigger than just me now." He was right. In the months that followed, the Riverside miracle became a case study in medical journals and the subject of theological discussions. Some dismissed it as mass hysteria or statistical anomaly. Others saw divine intervention. Most landed somewhere in between, acknowledging the mysterious power of hope, community, and faith. For Sadie, now 11 and starting a new school year, the miracle was simple. Her uncle was alive, coaching Little League again and rebuilding his carpentry business. Her grandmother smiled more. And sometimes, when she passed strangers on the street who recognized her from the news stories, they nodded with respect and something like gratitude. The hospital eventually created a Letters of Hope program, providing stationery for patients to write messages of encouragement to others facing similar challenges. Dr. Wilson co-authored a paper on the psychological and physiological benefits of community support in healing environments. 1 year later, Thomas stood healthy and strong as Sadie graduated from elementary school. As they celebrated at home with a small gathering of family and friends, Nurse Roberts arrived with a special gift, a leather-bound book containing copies of hundreds of letters that had been written in response to Sadie's original message. "We thought you should have this," Nurse Roberts explained. "A record of what your faith started." That evening, as the summer twilight stretched long shadows across the yard, Sadie sat on the porch swing beside her uncle. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't written that letter?" she asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I think God had a plan for me, Sadie girl, but I also think sometimes he needs someone brave enough to start the conversation." He smiled down at his niece. "You were that someone." Inside the house, Esther watched them through the window, her brother, given a second chance at life, and her granddaughter, whose simple faith had touched countless lives. The radio played softly in the background, Aretha Franklin singing Amazing Grace, the Queen of Soul giving voice to the miracle they had witnessed. "Faith of a child," Esther murmured to herself, "just like the good book says." As night fell over Atlanta, in hospital rooms and homes across the city and beyond, people continued to tell the story of the little black girl whose letter to God had sparked not just one healing, but many, a ripple effect of hope and connection that had transformed a community. And Sadie, watching fireflies rise in the gathering darkness, understood at last what her grandmother had always taught her. That faith, like love, multiplies when shared. That healing comes in many forms. And that sometimes the miracle isn't the answer to the prayer, it's what happens to the people who pray it. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.